Hello, and welcome to my overview of the celebrity traitors so far, which is episodes 1 to 6. We'll be looking at every murder and every banishment, and I'm going to discuss what decisions I thought were good, ones that were downright terrible, and everything in between. But before that, let's look at the traitor choices. So the traitors this time round are Jonathan Ross, Kat Burns, and Alan Carr. This is honestly a really good batch of traitors to have, and if I were a producer, I would probably pick these three. They appeal to most general demographics, as Jonathan is in his 60s, Kat in her 20s, and Alan vehicular manslaughter is just there because, it's hilarious. However, as traitors, even though they've all made it to at least episode 7, I don't think they're all that great. Alan's acting is especially jarring for me, and I don't want to be presumptuous, but I honestly think that I would have gone after him if I were in the game. It's kind of the same with Jonathan, as he kind of seems like this looming figure in the shadows, but I'm willing to give him a bit more leeway as it's obviously worked given he's been in the spotlight so much. Now Kat might seem in the clear as she doesn't have any of these glaring faults, but she always seems quite unprepared whenever giving an answer at the round table, and I think her cracks are starting to show. If I had to put money on any of them winning, it would be Kat, but truthfully I think the faithful are probably going to win this season. Now onto the first murder, which was Paloma. I don't have anything to say on the murder, as it was just sort of what happened in the moment, but I will briefly talk about Alan. Paloma's murder has sort of put Alan in the clear, but honestly, I'd be thinking more about the murder in plain sight as time went on. I'd think about who was around Paloma most of the time, which would be Alan and Ruth. With Ruth being murdered, I'd pile more heat on Alan. But he seemed to make people forget about the whole thing, so I'll give him some credit where it's due. Now onto the banishment of Nico, and you can see everyone's votes there on the screen. I read an article about how Nico knew the fewest celebrities going into the game, and that definitely played against him. Despite his defense being genuinely solid, I think he was always going to be fighting an uphill battle, and I don't exactly blame anyone for voting him based on all the evidence up to that point. I actually predicted that Nico would be the first banished going in, so I'm pretty proud of myself for that. But yeah, I think he'd have been banished eventually anyway, just like how Mark was. Now the murder of Tom Daly. This is where I start to have issues. You can see that the murder was between Tom, Claire, and Joe Wilkinson, and I think the smartest move here would have been Joe. Tom received 2 votes at the round table, and would have been a prime suspect at the round table, especially helped by the fact that Joe Wilkinson voted for him, alongside Nico. Had Joe been murdered, Tom would have been seen to be getting rid of any opposition, making him almost certainly banished that round. Having Joe not around also would have helped Jonathan, as the big dog theory likely wouldn't have taken off without his input. I think this was just kind of a wasted murder, and evidence that the traitors aren't the geniuses that we might expect them to be. On to the banishment of Tamika. I honestly don't really know where this came from. There was obviously some tension with Mark, but I think it was largely that she seemed to be overacting. This is actually good evidence to follow, but it just makes me wish they'd look at Alan, who overacts nearly as much as Tamika did, but to be fair, none of them hold a candle to Kate Garraway. Tamika was banished pretty closely, as there were something like 10 people who got a vote at this banishment, so it could have been swayed, but I don't have too much more to say on this. It was slightly random, but not one I berate them for too hard. Now, onto the murder of Ruth. Now, I initially thought this was an insane choice, but upon reflection, it might actually be the smartest murder they've done up to this point. Ruth really was never going to get off Jonathan's back, and murdering her early on made it look like the traitors were framing Jonathan. My one issue with this, though, is that it does a bit of a pull. What I mean is that Jonathan is now always going to be viewed with suspicion, and sooner or later, he will be banished. The faithful can whittle down to as few as 2 players, and no faithful, given the choice, is going to choose to share the money with Jonathan Ross. Now, the other people up for murder were Charlotte Church and David Alusiga, and honestly, it was wise keeping them both in, as they created suspicion around themselves. The one thing is that I wish they considered murdering Nick or Lucy, who are obviously faithfuls. They always seem to gamble really tightly with players who already have suspicion on them. I don't really know. Anyway, the banishment of Claire Alopecia. This was an insane round table, as it was sort of between Claire, Jonathan, and Charlotte, but Jonathan expertly manipulated everyone not to vote for him except Joe Marler. Now, Claire's defense was alright, but I personally wasn't too compelled by her arguments. She was banished with exactly half the vote, so not too great a showing for her. Jonathan just seemingly is good at persuasion, not too much to say here. The murder of Charlotte Church was the dumbest decision made by the traitors all game. Everyone suspected her. She was a shoo-in for the next day's banishment. It might have caused a bit of chaos and confusion, but why disrupt a game that's so obviously going to turn out in your favour? At this point, Jonathan's on top of the world, and the last thing he needs is more and more of the suspicious people going out. This is where I really wish they'd murder Nick or someone so obviously faithful. Traitors don't need to shock people, they just need to be effective, and this is the clearest example of that. Next was the tied vote between David and Mark, and the banishment of Mark. I think the reasons given for both of them were totally fair enough and believable, although it's also worth noting that Kate got some votes at this round table too, which I also thought was reasonable. See, there actually can be decent theories for why faithfuls could be traitors, and honestly, you have to give the traitors some credit for that. Anyway, it was obviously luck that determined who got banished, and the fact that it was Mark was slightly bad for the traitors, as I feel like he'd have been a talking point for the next banishment. David clearly wasn't, and people just sort of left him alone after the tide vote. Right, now the murder of Joe Wilkinson. This, out of all the people who didn't have a shield, was probably the smartest murder, so I'll give some credit to the traitors here. Joe was intelligent, and based on the Uncloaked episode, he would have voted for Jonathan, even though he sort of defended him publicly, so it was sort of the best of both worlds for the traitors. I'm just glad they didn't murder Stephen Fry, as murdering him would have just been such a pointless move, as he never really brought any great theories that many people believed in. And now for the banishment of Sir Stephen Frying Pan. It kinda came out of nowhere. I was absolutely expecting Jonathan, or at the very least Joe, to go, but somehow everyone was just suspicious of him, and he didn't really help himself by saying, "I'm a faithful," but of course a traitor would say that also. I've personally had so many people in my online traders say that, and then, I just know they're a traitor. Stephen sadly didn't deliver on the detective front like many expected he would, but I'm still sad to not see him win. How Jonathan Ross is able to avoid capture every single round table is just entertaining as anything, and I actually really hope he wins. And now for the murder face-to-face, that we haven't seen. I'm not here to speculate based on their reactions, but I will say they've probably murdered Kate, because it would be the stupidest decision, and the traitors this series are kind of prone to do that. If I were a traitor, though, I'd immediately get rid of Nick, because he was aligned with Joe Marler, and everyone kind of hated him anyway for what he did with the shields. Nick is kind of playing 4D chess at this game, and if the faithful win, I'd kind of like for him to be part of that, but I am sympathetic to the traitors this game, even though I don't think they're playing that well. Anyway, food for thought. And here's a ranking of all the players so far. Feel free to add your own opinions in the comments, and I might even react to some in a follow-up to this episode, which will probably release after episodes 7 and 8. I haven't posted in a while, so it's nice to have a bit more of an active season. Once again, great to see you all here, and I hope to see you next time.